Welcome to the Deeks.ai podcast, where Wake Forest innovators unpack the real-world magic of artificial intelligence through candid conversations. I'm Michael Ferrari.
I'm Ryan Scholl.
Please join us as we explore how artificial intelligence is transforming work across campus, one fascinating story at a time. Does generative artificial intelligence open up new possibilities for assessing higher education students, or are professors fighting a battle against the next wave of disruptive education technology? Listen to the conversation between Wake Forest University faculty members Kit, Karen, Keith, and Shannon as they discuss the opportunities and pitfalls that Gen AI presents when defining the learning outcomes in their classrooms and assessing student mastery.
Welcome back to the wildly popular Deeks.ai Roundtable series, still the #1 artificial intelligence higher education podcast at Wake Forest University. Today, I am truly honored to be in the presence of 4 members of our esteemed faculty. We have Shannon McKean, Kit Pribble, Karen Spira, and Keith Robinson. Now, in the last roundtable discussion, we tackled student learning given the presence of generative artificial intelligence. Today, we are going to talk about how student assessments have evolved, or not, in this current education landscape. Not only have teaching styles adapted at a feverish pace, but we are also now given the opportunity, or being forced, depending on your perspective, to embrace new ways of assessing mastery. So I want to turn this conversation over to our faculty, but I'd like them to introduce themselves first. So let's go.
Hi, my name is Keith Robinson. I am a professor of law at Wake Forest University School of Law, where I teach a number of technology and law courses, including AI law and litigation, and thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Karen Spira, and I'm Assistant Director of the Center for the Advancement of Teaching at Wake Forest, and I'm also a professor of Spanish. And prior to coming to Wake Forest, I was a full-time Spanish faculty member for a number of years at a small liberal arts college.
My name is Kit Pribble. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of German and Russian, where I teach courses in Russian language as well as Russian literature and culture in English translation. And I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
My name is Shannon McKean. I'm a professor of practice here in the business school. Most of my teaching is in the experiential learning space, and I think AI has a big opportunity in experiential learning, and I am also excited to be here.
Well, good, because I'm excited to be here and basically listen. This is gonna be fun for me. I'm not gonna hopefully have to do too much work, but I do want to start with a warm-up question I'm gonna lob in here. And actually, I'm gonna direct this one first to Karen. Karen, why do we measure to what level a student has mastered a concept? Like, what is the purpose of student assessments?
So a little tiny question to get us started. What is the purpose of assessments? So most, all departments and have in their majors and minors student learning outcomes. They have a picture in their mind of where they want their students to be at the end of the course of study. And we're constantly tracking where students are in that journey. So in the first year or 2 of studies, we expect students to be getting their feet wet with concepts and methodologies and content knowledge. And then as they approach senior year, we really want to start to see mastery across all of the student learning outcomes that have been discerned for a particular discipline.
Can I add to that?
It's your conversation.
Thanks. No, I totally agree with what Karen said. I think coming from a professional school, the student learning is primary, but secondary is employers expect our graduates to be able to do certain things. And so we have to assure that whatever the expectations are, if we agree with them, that the students are meeting them. And what Karen just said is a great way to kind of assess that.
So at this institution and others, we provide instruction. We're hoping to get students to a certain level, but it's also incumbent on the students to be motivated to follow our course of study, our learning objectives. And so when you talk about student motivation, I think part of, and what is their motivation to follow the assignments or do the assessments in the intended way?
So
I was looking at Kit.
Yeah, I'll start. I think we hope that the students' motivation would be that they are in class to learn the material, learn a particular skill, uh, gain an understanding of a particular set of knowledge, right? And the one signal that they receive as to whether or not they are accomplishing that goal is some sort of assessment. Uh, the sort of not so altruistic view is that the motivation is to get a good grade, right? So that they can get a good job or get into the grad school that they want to get into. Um, and so again, the way in which we assign and assess those grades is through assessment. And so ultimately, I think my goal as a professor, as an instructor, is to make sure that those two motivations are aligned in some way. That I am giving a good grade to students uh, that have grasped and mastered the material and have worked hard in my class.
Yeah, I want to say I'm glad that Keith brought up the question of grades because I think when this question of student motivation comes up, we want to think a lot about intrinsic motivation, getting the students to kind of care about the subject matter, feeling really invested in their own learning and progress. And I think there's a lot of research to show, Karen, you would know more about this than I do, but research to show that student motivation and buy-in into the subject matter is one of the best predictors of success in learning. So motivation is incredibly important. I do think it is the case that sometimes the intrinsic motivation can be a little bit harder to find with some groups of students, depending on the types of classes. And so I do think that grades kind of function in this way to give an external motivation if particularly in I teach, for example, some divisional courses, first year seminars, where those courses are often maybe not the top priority for some of the students. And so, grades do come into it, although I appreciate what Keith said about kind of trying to encourage the students to see the matchup between the grade that they're trying to get and then also the value of the thing that they're being graded on. So hopefully we can kind of guide them to feeling motivated to master the subject material for its own sake.
And go
You,
ahead.
Karen, please.
Well, I wanted to chime in about a specific subset of assessments that are sometimes referred to as authentic assessments. And those can be really motivating for students because they have to do with producing something that has value outside of the framework of the class. So the students might be creating podcasts to share information that they're learning. They might be creating quirky YouTube videos. They might be going to a high school and doing a presentation to local high schoolers to teach them about science. And we as the instructors can see through these authentic assessments the extent to which students have mastered certain learning outcomes. And at the same time, they're very motivating for students because there's an authentic audience and an authentic purpose. They're not just filling out a multiple choice quiz.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to add a comment on both things. First of all, I think so to what Kit said, we've all been in classes where there are students in the room who are there for learning and very much see it as hopefully a transformational experience. And there's others who see it as a transactional experience, and how to tailor to both groups. And it's not necessarily bimodal, but there's a spectrum in there, and make sure everyone's engaged. And I love the authentic assessment idea. That's what experiential learning is about. We try to make sure that it's as real as possible to get them engaged. Not easy, but that's what the goal is.
Yeah, I think I want to add to the discussion of motivation that I'm really glad that this topic came up because certainly when we talk about generative AI and assessment, I think it's really important that we're thinking about student motivation because the more motivated a student is to buy into their own learning tasks or into the course material, the less likely they are to use generative AI, I think, in ways that we would maybe identify as not ideal, unauthorized, disallowed in some way. And I think, it's come up on earlier episodes of this podcast that there are ways to use generative AI that are kind of scaffolding learning, encouraging students to engage in a more genuine and deep way with the subject matter. And then there's also ways that learners might use generative AI to outsource some of their learning. The more motivated a student is in the subject matter, the more likely they are, I think, to use it in those ways we might want them to use it to support rather than outsource learning. And so when I teach two really different types of classes, one is Russian language classes, and one is those kind of literature divisionals and first-year seminars. And the Russian language classes tend to be self-selecting students who are highly motivated. They're coming into the classroom already really interested in learning Russian. It's not many students that decide that they want to spend their time learning Russian. And so those that do usually have a really good reason to be there. And so the conversations I've had with students about generative AI in the Russian language classes are really different than the ones that I've had with students in my first year seminars and divisional classes, where maybe they need a little bit more guidance to understand kind of what they're doing there and why they should be spending their time in these classes.
There's two ways to really look at assignments and assessments when we talk about generative AI. To look at the negative, nefarious uses, I'm going to, I hate the word, but cheap, the challenge to academic integrity. And then there's ways to look at what are the new ways that we can assess student. So, we have educators who have quietly, or some not quietly, reverted back to the infamous Blue Book. There's proctored handwritten exams. It's the principled return to the hallowed academic rigor versus potentially new ways. We're talking about podcast, experiential learning, more oral versus written. Now, are we in a battle of attempting to hold on to the sacred ideals of assessment versus a new age, or is there a place for both? You all are coming from very different disciplines. We are talking about undergraduate school versus professionals. So I've lobbed a whole bunch of factors in there. Does that matter? Or is there one path for assessing students?
I'm happy to share the way I'm thinking about this right now. I actually was invited yesterday to the environmental studies retreat, and they had asked me to provide a workshop on teaching in the age of AI. So I created a workshop that I titled AI Aware Teaching after a publication that's coming out in September, the Norton Guide to AI Aware Teaching. I really like that term. And one of the things I did was give the faculty 4 overarching strategies that they can use to revise assignments to make them more AI aware. And my strategies included both. So I'm definitely in my first quadrant was moving assignments into class. So of course there's the Blue Book exam. We also have a lot of faculty at Wake Forest who are choosing to quiz their students more frequently than they used to, including very brief quizzes, just so that there is some ongoing formative assessment that they can count on being reliable. Because if you send students home to do a short assignment for homework, you just can't know whether the extent to which they might have used AI. But another quadrant in the schema that I gave the faculty was included what some faculty are calling sandwiches. And the idea of a sandwich is that there are, the bottom bread might be the foundation of your sandwich, might be an AI intensive experience. The meat of the sandwich might be a learning experience where there is no AI, it's a completely analog experience, then you're going back to AI, or vice versa. So I really think that there's room for all of these different kinds of assignments and assessments.
Yeah, I think you covered all 4 quadrants when we talked on the phone last. I wrote them all down. I've been using them already. So those are very, very helpful. I think to me, it's all about designing those assessments. And this may be controversial with some colleagues, but I think we're in the middle of this transformation from being people who deliver content to students deliver knowledge. They can get knowledge anywhere, to help them design experiences or design assessments to make sure that they are trusting the right sources for that knowledge and then demonstrating use of that knowledge. So active versus passive learning. And I think that is where AI is pushing us. I just read this book called Epic Disruptions, and this author looked at 11 innovations over the last 100 years and looked for common themes. And one of his premises was that what innovation does is just pushes friction somewhere else. An example he uses is automobiles allowed us to travel greater distances, but increase the number of accidents. So there's all these things. So AI is just pushing the friction to a different point. So I think it's going to be the design of the assessments as opposed to policing, even in Blue Book exams. I think that's going to be harder.
Keith, we've talked in the past how the law profession itself is changing because of AI. Has that changed how you've had to assess the students?
Yeah, so there are a couple points that I wanted to make based off of what Karen said. So I think I think first, if you look at professors, I think that what AI has done is forced us to assess our students in ways that we probably should have been doing 5 to 10 years ago, based on pedagogy, based on best practices for student assessments. And so, Karen mentioned having frequent quizzes, right? And so students uh, learn better through active recall, and that research is well founded. And so one of the things that I think AI is doing is sort of bringing to light and making people realize that we do need to assess our students in these ways. Second, with respect to the law specifically, I tell my students all the time in class that when they become practicing lawyers, they are going to uh, find value, or their clients will find value in them in the gray areas, right? So anything that is sort of straightforward, cut and dry legal problem, a client is not going to want to pay excessive lawyer fees for a lawyer to solve that problem. The client is going to engage a lawyer, pay them hundreds, if not thousands of dollars an hour for a problem where there's ambiguity, where there is no answer that you can look to in the past. It's a unique problem in the gray area. And so I think then the natural result of that is that when we assess our students, we need to find those gray areas in the law and the subjects that we are teaching them, and craft our assessments to push them to start solving those problems in the classroom. Let's not wait until they get out into the real world, because what we know AI is good at and is trained on is the past, right? And so AI has everything that has happened from a legal standpoint, AI has been trained on. And so if I give my students a question or problem based on a past legal case, they should easily be able to figure out an approach based off of using AI. But if I test them on some novel legal theory that has not been resolved, then they have to think for themselves because there isn't an answer. And so I think our assessments have to be geared toward more toward that gray area now more than ever.
I have a question. Ryan, you mentioned early on about students looking for shortcuts through assessments, cheating, and that's a human temptation to take a shortcut if you're under pressure and a lot going on. So it's not a new thing. AI has just scaled it so that it's easier to access. But Karen, you said something in our meeting the other day that language professors have been struggling with this for years because there's been other shortcuts out there. So, Kit, I'm curious, how have you managed that in the time you've been teaching the Russian language classes to not use Google Translate or whatever the equivalent is that's out there?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing that up. And Karen, I don't know if that was part of what you were thinking about, but that comment was about Google Translate. It does feel like in the world languages profession, this problem of generative AI it feels less new than it does maybe in some other pedagogical contexts, because Google Translate has been such a big problem for so long already. Um, So I would say, my experience with teaching language courses is that it feels the kind of existence and coming onto the scene of generative AI over the past few years has felt less disruptive and like less of a problem than it has in the literature and culture courses that I teach. Partially again, because the students are very intrinsically motivated. Certainly in Russian, that might be less the case in some larger, more commonly taught language classes. But also just because, particularly somewhere like Wake Forest, where we have really small classes, we get to know our students really well. A lot of my students, I'm with them from their first semester to their last semester of Russian language study. I'm very familiar with what they're capable of, and that has always been the solution to the Google Translate problem. Is in language classes, it's often really easy to tell when a student has used Google Translate because you, as the language instructor, if the classes are smaller, which at Wake Forest they are, you know what they're capable of and what they're not capable of. And so misuse of some of these tools is pretty easy to identify. And that has continued to be the case with generative AI as well. So I would say, yeah, it feels less disruptive in that context, both because of the intrinsic motivation and then just because it's not a new problem. And I don't know, Karen, if you would agree with that, if that's your sense in Spanish or if it's different there.
Definitely, I can speak to the language classes. I don't think there's been a huge shift because for example, in elementary or even intermediate language classes, it's very common practice just to have students write the first draft of a composition in class where they didn't have the temptation of Google Translate. And then there might be revision that's done at home. I'm curious in asking you, Kit, about the thesis-driven original like research paper or work of literary analysis, because even if students are not having a chat bot generate the, sentence by sentence prose for them, it seems like generating a thesis statement used to be something that we would just sit and sweat in the library, paging through our novels or, scrutinizing poems. And it was this very arduous process. And ostensibly, that's something that chatbots can do for students now. Or they can say, here's a thesis that my professor says is not arguable. Like, how can I make it arguable? So I'm wondering how you and colleagues are handling that, and whether you see any role for generative AI in supporting students in developing those skills, or whether it's just something that you try to restrict.
Yeah, and so are you thinking about outside of, not in the language class, but
in the literature, in like an upper division
Yep.
literary
yeah,
class
in
focused on
English
literature?
translation.
Yeah, sure, in English
Right, yeah.
translation.
Yeah, and I think that's another reason why the problem feels more manageable in language classes is because it is pretty easy to do most things synchronously in class in person because third semester language student is not going to be going out and writing a huge research paper in Russian anyway, right? They're doing small compositions that you can do in class. This is not the case in the literature courses, the writing courses. Yes, this is something that I'm still kind of trying to find an answer to. I have in my first year seminars, in my literature courses, I have experimented a lot with incorporating generative AI into various aspects of the scaffolding of research papers, things like that. Having students solicit particular types of feedback from a chatbot and then reflect on that feedback and kind of provide, a justification for accepting or not accepting that feedback. I would say in the past year or so, I've done a lot less of that and have been moving more towards actually just doing things in class, in person, because when you involve so much kind of scaffolding from generative AI and you're asking the students to engage with these tools, the learning outcome starts to become about engaging critically with generative AI tools, which is a worthwhile learning outcome. But it's not necessarily my primary learning outcome for my Russian literature survey course. I also want them to learn things about Dostoevsky. And so time spent talking about generative AI is, although, you can bring in Dostoevsky in really interesting ways in a conversation about generative AI, but, it does take time away. So and I think a lot of colleagues, this seems to be the case, is shifting actually more towards the old school methods, the blue book, the quizzes and things like that. And Karen, I read your piece recently in Inside Higher Ed on the human intelligence labs, and I think that is an incredible idea. I am all for it. If we had something like that, I would absolutely send students there because, the problem with these old school methods is they don't they don't give you a way forward for larger research papers, right? There's no way that we can have students do every step of a research paper in front of us. So that's a problem I'm kind of stumped on, but I like the idea of so I almost said language labs, the human intelligence labs.
How? Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm curious how you all think about the reading aspect of what students are asked to do. I'll, a legal opinion that would take me maybe 15 minutes to read and digest will probably take a first year law student like an hour and a half. I want them to go through it. I want them to struggle. I want them to look up words that they don't know. That used to be the only way that they could do it. And now, they just throw the legal case into AI, and AI gives them a summary. So how are you thinking about reading? How are you assessing whether your students have actually read the material that you've given them to read?
So something Karen said earlier, for me, so this is not a new concept, but I'm relatively new to teaching. I've only been a full-time professor for 4 years. And so I've really embraced the flipped classroom, and so they have to do a lot of work outside of class before they come into class. And what we do in class is more interactive, and I can observe them in action. And so I give more quizzes, and my quizzes have changed. So I tell them, listen, if you ask AI to summarize this for you, you won't do well in the quiz. I'm not asking you exactly, which page this word appear on, but I'm getting specific.
Yep.
So you have to make sure you do it. And I tell them this is a nudge. You read the book Nudge. It's, as humans, we take a shortcut, and this is just a nudge to remind you to stay accountable for the reading. And so the quizzes are low stakes, but we have very competitive students. And even though it's a low stakes quiz, they want to do well on it. And so that's one tool, particularly for those transactional learners, that I at least make sure that we can have a richer conversation in the classroom because they read the reading because they want to do well on the quiz.
Funny you say that. I noticed when Karen mentioned quizzes earlier, everyone started nodding. Is that the case that we all definitely, yeah. I'm a big fan of the reading quiz. I've started implementing it very extensively in my literature and first year seminar courses. And Shannon, you mentioned the term policing earlier. And I think actually by having these, I call them accountability quizzes, right? Rather than kind of to shift the focus from like trying to catch students out to saying, I'm giving you this mechanism of accountability so that when you're sitting in your dorm room and trying to decide, am I going to spend time reading this Tolstoy novella or doing something that maybe feels more immediately beneficial, I have this accountability mechanism that's going to like help me prioritize the Tolstoy novella. And so, so I think that this is a really good way actually to avoid feeling like we're policing or surveilling our students because it's such a cut and dried check-in mechanism. We don't have to kind of be looking suspiciously at their writing, trying to catch out, are there too many M dashes or something like that? It's very cut and dry. And I'm a big fan of the reading quiz.
I wanted to refer back to something Keith mentioned, which is that AI can exert a kind of positive pressure on us. And I think that is implicit in what we're discussing right now around quizzing. You made reference to retrieval practice and how important that is for learning. And actually when students take the quiz, that's like another instance of them doing retrieval practice. So it serves two purposes. It doesn't just allow us to assess what they know, but it actually further cements that learning for them in their mind, which is exciting. But I wanted to share with you, I've come across testimonials from different faculty across the country talking about how AI has pushed them to come up with pedagogical techniques that have yielded better results than they've ever had before. So I'll share this one strategy. This was shared by William Montgomery. He is a professor in the Gen Ed program at Clarkson College, and he wanted to hold his students accountable for doing readings. So he started to implement an analog annotation assignment where whenever there's a reading for class, and he teaches classes like healthcare ethics or history of medicine, students have to annotate the PDF. They can either print the PDF up and annotate it by hand, or they can use a stylus and a tablet. And then he has a discussion board prompt that they have to respond to. And when they respond, they have to upload an image of the annotated text and he shows them what kind of annotations he wants, brackets, marginal notes. And so they essentially have to provide evidence for their quote, for their argument. And he says that the posts are better than the posts that he received pre-COVID or pre-AI. And really celebrated that students are basing their answers in specific details from the reading and not just, some garbage that they might have read on the internet that has nothing to do with it. So it's really exciting to come across the creativity that professors are having to embrace. And I also want to recognize the workload is tremendous. And with my idea of human intelligence labs, part of the intervention there is to say that we can't just tell professors they have to teach differently because we're running out of bandwidth. We need support from our institutions by reinventing the spaces where our students are learning and reinventing some of the basic building blocks of their education. But I think it is really exciting to see the really scrappy ways that faculty are coming up with to push back.
I love that. I love the analog component, that it's not using a platform like Perusal or something. It's rather having uploaded images of like a marked up text with highlight and brackets. That's fantastic. I love it.
And that again is the sandwich idea, of like there's the analog and there's the digital, that they can coexist.
Keith, I'm curious, the example that you brought up about your students reading these legal briefs. Is this something, so because you're teaching, and you and Shannon are both teaching in a professional school in a professional context, and I think we've already touched on a little bit how that's somewhat different from, some undergraduate divisionals, something like that. For your students, kind of the skills that they're learning maybe feel more immediately useful, and they see how they're going to apply them in the jobs that they're going to have. So with that particular example, is having a generative artificial intelligence platform summarize those readings, is it costing them something that they're going to need when they are working as lawyers? Or is that something that they can just do once they're actually practicing?
Yeah, so I think there are two things, right? So I think just from a intellectual standpoint, I think it is costing them the intellectual training and the intellectual rigor that you need to sit down and spend an hour and a half, 2 hours working through some writing and understanding what you are reading, going back and starting over. Oh, I was reading, but I wasn't really paying attention to that paragraph. Now I'm lost, right? And so now I have to go back and start over. And I think that there's something to sort of training your brain, right, to do that, because when you get into practice, you're going to have to sit down and read for long hours, write for long hours. So I think you're just sort of building that muscle. But I also think, and my students will, they sometimes kid me about this, but I'll talk to them even about, hey, you're a lawyer, you want to read things for yourself and understand for yourself, right? Don't rely on the news to tell you what a Supreme Court opinion means, right? Once we give you the tools, you can go read it for yourself and understand sort of the nuance that fairly a reporter might have to summarize a very complex opinion in 5 sentences, right? But they're leaving out a lot, right? And so it's really about the training. But you definitely are going to have to read legal opinions, analyze them, and learn how to use them in practice. So perhaps one of the things we as law professors should impress upon our students is that this is not reading for the sake of reading. This is something that you will actually be doing when you graduate from law school.
The issue you raised, Kit, I think we see it most acutely in our MBA students who are working professionals. So most of them are using AI in their job for exactly the reasons you talk about, because it takes care of some of that foundational grunt work that they don't want to do anymore. And so when we ask them in the classroom to go back and do some of that foundational work, they complain about it, And so we talk about, there's not all of the assessments are unproductive. There's some friction in there that needs to be there, because that friction is where the learning happens and stretches your brain and makes you think. And if everything is frictionless, you're not going to learn. Take it away. So how do we convince them of that? One technique we've used, is just talking anecdotally about, if I read something carefully and you read something superficially, you're going to miss the novel connection that I'm going to make because some other experience I have. And that's where the value comes in a workplace, because if everyone's using AI to summarize documents, no one's doing the extra work to find a connection or a unique approach to the problem or a resource that they can use. So you can't always outsource it to AI. And some listen, some don't. What's your next prompt, Ryan?
Given that you all come from different areas and you all assess your students in different ways, are oral exams AI proof now, or are they a luxury? I know a lot of people have said, yes, we can get by, get past the writing or the take home by giving students oral, and that's the way we're going to assess student mastery now. But are they scalable? Is this the answer to really assess students now to test their knowledge?
Scalable? No, I don't think. I mean, it depends. In a class of 10, maybe. In a class of 45, not likely. And at least right now, I still think I'm not 100% accurate, but it's pretty clear to me when something's been produced by AI. One of the things we struggle with in the business school, and maybe it's true elsewhere, is that we can no longer assess the product. We have to assess the process. And an oral or a conversation is a great way to start assessing that process. So right now, it's clearly stated in my syllabus, because in the work that I do, I encourage them to use AI. They have to tell me how they used it. And I reserve the right to come back to them and say, yeah, I know you said you only used AI to generate some ideas and you wrote it yourself, but help me understand how you wrote this. How did you make this connection? Not to police them, not to catch them out, but for them to demonstrate, again, that they're learning, because if they didn't do it, they didn't learn, they're not getting a return on their investment. So the answer is, it's hard to scale, but we have to find a way to do it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I've definitely started using more oral assessments in my literature and culture courses, and that works for me because my courses are small. Again, another benefit of a place like Wake Forest. Certainly in the college, the classes tend to be small. The largest class I've ever taught had 21 students, and that was an outlier. Usually I have between 10 and 16, so it is totally possible. And I do see a lot of value in oral assessments, having a student sit down with you one-on-one and just talk through the things that they've been reading and learning. And if they've been doing these reading quizzes, right, you can feel pretty confident that maybe they've done a good chunk of the readings and you can have a good conversation. At the same time, I think that what you're assessing through an oral exam in a literature course, a literature seminar, for example, is different than what you're assessing through a research paper. An oral exam might be assessing, how well can they construct an oral argument specifically, which is different from a written argument. How well can they kind of navigate these issues, think on their feet? How well can they recall in the moment certain pieces of information? But that's sort of a different set of skills than what you're teaching and assessing through an analytical paper, a research paper, something like that. And so I don't think it's the full answer, because, the types of assessments we're able to give in some way shape the types of knowledge we're able to transmit to our students, right? Assessment is a way of guiding to students to particular skills or knowledge, not just checking to see if they have that skills and knowledge. So I think that there's, again, oral assessment, great tool, but it's not the only answer. And I think the research, the kind of fate of the research paper in the undergraduate, like literature or history or culture course is a problem.
Yeah, I want to second or third the value of oral assessments. And actually, that was another one of my quadrants in my workshop on AI aware teaching, is moving from writing to speaking, because chatbots can produce writing, but to have students speak about something extemporaneously does allow us to understand a certain set of skills. As Kit says, not every single skill. I think in terms of the practicalities of it, I think there are some structural things that faculty can do to make it doable. Oral exams are very common in language classes. Usually when we have an oral exam, we cancel a session of class. So that gives the faculty member more time. If it's a big class, maybe the faculty member says, this is a Tuesday, Thursday class. This is so important that this week, Tuesday or Thursday, and that gives the faculty member a lot of time. You can also have students come in pairs or in small groups. I've always done oral exams in pairs because students are so terrified to go to a professor's office by themselves for an oral exam. And I've been working with a faculty member in the humanities who tried this for the first time over the summer. And they ended up finding it to be this incredibly rewarding intellectual experience, both for them and for the students who were involved. And if we think about the kind of relationship-rich, face-to-face relational education that Wake Forest is all about, the oral exam is actually a really great fit for that.
Keith, I'm curious what you think, because again, being in another professional school, I try to tell my students that, as I reflect back on my career, some of the most monumental moments in my life have been a conversation, pitching something, selling something, defending something. So if we can do more oral, I think that's going to benefit our students.
Yeah, I do think that is true. And I think that there is a tradition of oral assessment in the law. I think what the law will struggle with is there's also a heavy emphasis on being able to write clearly. And there are some students that you put them in a room and they're not able to string 3 sentences together in conversation. But if you ask them to write out what they think, right, it reads like poetry. It's beautiful. And so I think oral assessment definitely has its place. I would probably think though that it couldn't be the only method. I would be very hesitant if someone came up to me and said, at the end of the semester, I give an oral exam in my class, and that is the only way I'm going to assess my students. I would be concerned about those students that could write really well, and 80% of what you're going to do as a lawyer is in fact writing. So I think for the law school, we still have a heavy emphasis on writing, and we still need to assess our students. But I definitely think oral assessment can be a great supplement to that.
You mentioned something, Keith, when we met earlier about what the University of Chicago is doing in the law school. I'm curious, Kit, maybe Kit wasn't there. What are Kit's thoughts on that?
Yeah, so
the audience?
This summer has been the summer of law schools releasing AI policies, right? And so the University of Chicago has decided that for the first year of law school, they are banning laptops from the classroom. So students can't use any sort of technology. I think you have to, you can't use your cell phone either, or have your cell phone out. And so that's one way that they are trying to address, I think, 2 things actually. They're trying to address AI and trying to address the problem of attention in the classroom. And then Berkeley also released a policy, and they've sort of they have a website where they've kind of clarified what the policy actually is, because the news said, oh, Berkeley is not letting their students use AI ever. And that's not quite the case. But what Berkeley said is that there are going to be some situations where we don't want students to use artificial intelligence, and we're not going to allow students to use artificial intelligence, which I think is a perfectly reasonable approach in the classroom.
What are your thoughts on, from where you sit, do you have any envy for your colleagues at the University of Chicago?
Well, I think there is, with respect to attention, right? I have a recent high school graduate where, his school now is implementing no cell phone. Like when they come to school, they have to put their cell phones in their locker and they can't have them all day. So I do think that there is to a certain extent, we are fighting a war for attention. There's just the laptop is you can't compete with a laptop for an hour and 15 minutes, right? There's going to be wandering attention, right? That's, before laptops, people would doodle. There's there's going to be something that's going to take a student's attention off of what's going on in the classroom. So to that extent, I think, and at Wake, we allow professors in the law school, at least, you can decide whether or not students can use laptops so long as you adhere to all the accessibility um, um, requirements, right? And so that's sort of that's the tension that we're running into in the law school, at least, is how do we follow the law and allow students with accommodations to participate in class. At the same time, how do we help the students combat the war against their attention, or the war for their attention, I should say.
I'm more worried about that war than I am about the attention war.
Yeah,
I think, and then maybe they're connected somehow. But
I think they are connected, especially now that and this has happened to me in class before, where I've said something and a student will raise their hand and say, "Hey, Professor Robinson, ChatGPT or Claude says this about what you just said," right? And so then I'm fighting against Claude and ChatGPT. I don't know exactly what the student typed in. So I think there's something to be said for that interaction too in the classroom, and I'm sure that's going to happen more frequently this semester in the fall.
When I hear about policies like the ones that you're mentioning at the University of Chicago or at UC Berkeley, to me, it sounds like such a gift to students to give them a space where they're being forced to bracket off access to these technologies. I mean, I find myself longing for a space like that in my own writing and research. It's hard. I'm sure we all have experienced that. It's hard to force yourself, or even to be able to like have the luxury of closing yourself off in a room without access to your phone, without constant notifications and updates. So students are at a point where maybe this is the one time in their life where they'll be able to be given a space to bracket those things off. And yeah, it sounds great. It sounds like a gift to me.
With the remaining time we have, I'd like to reframe this conversation a little bit in terms of AI as an enabler. Now, I don't have the luxury of being in the classroom, being in front of students, but I do study this industry extensively. And I've heard a lot of educators throw out there on all kinds of platforms, different things they're able to do now with students, different ways they're able to assess students that they weren't in the past. And some quick examples are creating an AI persona for students to debate and talk with. Students can now take their learning to a new level and create scenario-based projects, or create an app to do something, and now the student can engage with that and they take their learning to a different level. Is there anything that any of you have maybe tried or want to try that AI now enables that you could not do previously?
So I think in the language learning context, the go-to example of a long-standing problem that generative AI chatbots get towards solving is the lack of contact hours and the impact that has on conversation practice. So needing to find ways for students to practice conversing, chatting in the target language. This has always been an issue in language education, particularly if you have bigger classes, if you have fewer contact hours, if you live in a space where there's not many members or many people who natively speak the language that you're teaching. Certainly for Russian, right, with students living in Winston-Salem, they're not going to have access to a lot of native Russian speakers to practice with. So unless they're coming from a family that's Russian speaking, they might not have many opportunities for conversation practice. So chatbots do fill or get towards filling that gap a little bit. I've done a lot of experimentation with chatbots for conversation practice in all levels of my Russian language classes, kind of mixed results. As with most things, it seems to come down mostly to how motivated and invested the student is. So some students have found it really productive. So I'll make usually custom GPTs that are tailored to the level of the student, and they've been, I'll provide kind of vocabulary lists, materials from class so that it's kind of sticking to the type of language the student is already familiar with, and it'll stay at their target. And then I'll give them prompts for chatting, a certain number of minutes and having that conversation out of class, and then they'll come back. And it's worked pretty well. Again, kind of varied results depending on how invested the student is in that task. But so conversation practice and language learning is one area.
To build on that, I've used at least in 2 instances. One, I mentioned I do experiential learning class. So the students are on teams working with an external organization to solve a business challenge. And some of the assignments are team assignments. And in a perfect world, I would be there with them when they were building their team charter, when they're building their work plan, when they're scoping the project. And I can't be with all the teams. And so I built a GPT that's there as a guide to work with them and help them through the process and hopefully push them so the scope of work, the work plan, the team charter is more robust in the end. And it's good for them to get that feedback in the moment, as opposed to a week later when I send back my comments out of context, who said what. I don't think it lands quite as well. And I can see the chat that they use, so I can see just how deeply did they push. In the past, some teams have had someone who's very diligent and they've kind of pushed the team along. But I've also had teams where no one's that diligent in that moment, and so AI can help push them along. The other way I've used it is that we give a lot of case assignments in a class, and one of the things I try to teach in my class is being comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And so what we can do with GPTs or case is add a lot more nuance. And so we have this case we do, it's across all of the classes in the fall semester for the MSBA program, and they have an assignment in each one of those classes. But the overall case is something that we wrote, and then we did a GPT to play the different roles of the protagonist in the case. And so they can interview the marketing officer and the risk management person and the CEO and the salesperson to get different perspectives, recognizing that what they have to do for this task, who are they trying to appease? Is the CEO, is the marketing person, is the finance person, is the risk person, because they all have slightly different things. So it makes it for a richer experience. So I think that's very helpful. So I'm actually quite bullish on what AI can do to help us get scrappy in designing assessments for our students.
One of my classes, I created a prompt for the students that would create a hypothetical client for them to interview. And the idea was that the client was a little bit uncooperative, a little bit pushy, and the students had to interview the client, uh, get the legal information that they were interviewing the client for, and also navigate the relationship and submit the transcript of the interview. And I thought that was a really good exercise for the students. Also, what we found out is that depending upon the student and what AI they use, the client behaved differently, which I thought was also a really interesting experiment for the students to see that, again, the nature of this AI technology is built on probability. It is not going to give you the same exact answer every time. And so that was a really, I think, a valuable and fun exercise for the students.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So I think in conversations like this excite me because I'm really impressed and excited with what all these colleagues are doing around AI. I worry that there's a subset of us, I'm not sure if it's 2 or if it's 200, who just because of the lack of time and resources, that it's just such an overwhelming task dealing with all this. I'm sure there's at least one person out there who decided to retire early, maybe not at Wake Forest, but somewhere else, just because it's so overwhelming. And so how do we make it so that tell more stories like this, plug for deeks.ai, about how people are using it and the opportunities that it provides. There are risks, but I think we can't ignore those risks. I'm curious what you all think. Maybe you're representative of your departments and some of the business school that is.
I mean, it's difficult, especially right now. I feel like, and I don't know if you all have a similar sense, but we're in a moment of kind of cultural backlash against generative AI. And so, which is a switch from where it was about 2 years ago. And I wonder if you've encountered that with your students as well. Because I'll say, certainly with doing the custom GPT conversation partner examples, I've had many students who find it really kind of unpleasant and even repugnant to be asked to go home and chat with a chatbot, right? They're like, what we could put in a little bit more effort and surely find access to a human speaker of Russian, right? And I think, and that is probably, that's true, right? So yeah, maybe that's not in any way an answer to this question. It's just an additional follow-up
It's a
question.
great reminder, great point. I mean, and we don't have as many of those students in the business school, but we have some.
I feel like my mind goes to the idea of I'm not sure if this is the right term, but polyculture and the idea that we should have. I think it's actually salutary that we have professors because the future is so uncertain and we don't want to surrender too much to AI. That to have faculty, I talk to faculty who say I never use AI and I don't want to. And I think that that is helpful for students to be in different environments and that there's valuable things for them to learn in those different environments.
I agree. I'd only push back as hopefully that professor, if it's an informed decision, that's great.
Mhm.
And there is a professor here who's done certain things in the accounting department the same way ever. And I believe they have explored it. And no, I'm sticking with the way I've got because CPA exam and all that. But there's also, I think, some examples of folks who just, it's overwhelming. So I'm just going to look the other way.
So I like the term AI aware, right? AI aware teaching, being informed about the capabilities. And I have encountered many colleagues, particularly on the kind of literature side of things, that have done no exploration whatsoever and are kind of naively optimistic that these tools are less capable than they actually are. And I think there's some risk there. So I would agree with that.
We've dealt with the same thing in the law school, and not just at Wake, across the country, where 2 years ago the stories that you would read about in the paper would be lawyers getting in trouble for filing briefs with incorrect citations that were generated by AI, and so I think in a way that soured a lot of people on artificial intelligence to think, oh, well, you know, it's not useful. Well, that was 2 years ago, and AI is only getting better. And so I tell my colleagues, you, yes, there are resources out there, but the way I learn, and I still feel like the best way to learn is to just sort of jump in and try and use it for a few tasks every day. And that's the best way to learn what it can do well, what its pitfalls are, and maybe use it on low stakes things like, gardening at home. Ask it some questions about your next vacation or gardening. It doesn't have to be something about in your discipline, so you can see what it is capable of and where it falls short. I think that's the best way to become AI aware, as you said.
Great advice.
And a plug for the great resources available through the Center for the Advancement of Teaching, which is where a lot of my initial experimentation with generative AI and pedagogy context came from, was from the CAT. So a lot
Yeah, I
of good
wanna-
stuff there.
Double check. You said last time we met, assessment in the classroom from writing to speaking, annotated socially and analog, and moving between analog and AI. Were those your 4 quadrants?
Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
You're a good note taker.
Analog notes.
Let's all note that Shannon is taking those with a pen and paper.
Right. Of course. Of course.
We all have pen and paper in
Right.
front of us right now.
We will have Gemini notebooks summarize this conversation later.
So you don't have to bother listening to the whole
Right.
podcast.
That's where we are going to end today. Thank you very much. And since we are making plugs, we have some resources on ai.wfu.edu. We have resources. Each of these professors have had extensive publishings online. You can find their information. There is an AI cafe if you are local to Wake Forest and want to participate in the discussions. And stay tuned because current planning for AI Fest is happening in December. So thank you again to everybody for joining us, and thank you to our listeners out there.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thanks again to our guests, and thanks for listening to the Deeks.ai podcast. Please continue to follow the AI discussion by subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. And if you have any comments, questions, or want to join the discussion, please email us at deeks.ai@wfu.edu.